I'm going to give you my top reasons why you should consider my top 3 tanks as a choice for you in Mists of Pandaria. Firstly, what are my top 3 tanks? Those would be Blood Death Knight, Brewmaster Monk, and Protection Warrior. Do remember as well, this is all about the first tier of raiding. All of the classes will change as they scale differently with stats throughout the expansion. We're focusing purely on the opening tier. Starting with a Blood Death Knight first. They've been the go-to main tank all through Cataclysm, and I don't see that changing for Mists of Pandaria. They put out absolutely amazing single target damage. They bring the option of some really powerful raid cooldowns with things like Anti-Magic Zone that just comes from a talent, or even Gore Fiend's Grasp, which is basically a mass grip to be able to get all of the adds into one place. Being able to completely remove the cooldown of Outbreak with a glyph, but it just makes it cost runic power instead, makes getting diseases on new targets an absolute breeze. And then with the ability to be able to Blood Boil to actually spread these diseases instead of using Pestilence feels absolutely fantastic. Getting your pet out that actually does significant damage now and being able to get really big self-heals on you without actually sacrificing the pet is another really huge personal cooldown, because now Death Pact, instead of sacrificing the pet, it just sacrifices 50% of its max health and gives you 50% of your max health. In a podcast recently with Riani, he was particularly excited about the 1 second global cooldown that they also get, which I'd have to mention because he mentioned it about 6,000 times. You even get an execute ability now in the form of Soul Reaper, where you do a decent amount of damage, and then after 5 seconds, if the target's still alive and below 35% health, it then does a truckload of damage. But if the enemy dies, you get 50% haste. So just a really, really nice execute ability. But overall, I still see the Blood Death Knight being the go-to main tank, with the off-tank being one of the second choices, which was between Brewmaster Monk and Protection Warrior. So let's start with Brewmaster Monk. If you want a tank on a super mobile class that actually feels like it's more of a DPS than a tank, and actually be ridiculously strong, then Brewmaster's probably for you. Having a huge absorb called Guard that you can use every 30 seconds, which not only does it guard you for a massive amount of damage, it also then increases self-healing on you whilst it's up. A statue that you can keep down that applies mini guards to the raid as well, so not only are you keeping absorbs on yourself, you're also helping with the raid healing. Having abilities like Clash that almost acts like a charge, Roll to be able to roll around all over the place, Tiger's Lust on a 30-second cooldown to be able to remove all immobilizing effects on you and increase your movement speed by 70%. Extremely impactful talent choices that you will adjust on a fight-by-fight basis. Hands down the most powerful challenge mode tank, to the point where sometimes you don't even need a healer, and you just feel like you're spinning lots of plates, very much like you would be if you was a DPS, because you're using blackout kicks to maintain a shuffle buff, which gives you 20% parry and increases your stagger amount, and stagger is a system completely unique to Brewmasters. Stagger causes 80% of damage taken from physical attacks to be taken immediately, and then the remaining 20% to be divided over 10 seconds. Stagger can be increased in many ways, like mastery or even passives, and you can completely cleanse that additional dot with Purifying Brew. I see Brewmaster Monk in MOC being a go-to off-tank or even main tank, and it's just a lot of fun to play. And finally, the Protection Warrior. Now, the Prot Warrior over the years has had its ups and downs, and it's definitely flying high in Mists of Pandaria. It will be absolutely amazing as both a main tank or an off-tank, and bring some really, did I say really enough? Good buffs and debuffs. The way you build and generate rage has now changed, so instead you do have builders and spenders, with abilities like Shield Slam granting rage, and then using that rage on a new ability called Shield Barrier. Shield Barrier is your way of absorbing damage, so you raise your shield, absorbing X amount of damage for the next 6 seconds. This will consume up to 60 rage, but only cost 20 rage to use initially, and the more rage you use and the more attack power you have increases the amount absorbed. So on the basis of our vengeance changes in Mists of Pandaria, where it's capped to your maximum health, you can get a lot of attack power and do a lot of absorbs. But the only decision you're having to make when it comes to spenders is using Shield Barrier to be able to absorb damage, Shield Block to give you 100% block chance. This costs 60 rage, has 2 charges on a 9-second recharge, or using excess rage for more damage on things like Heroic Strike and Cleave. You'll be able to get Vigilance, which is on a 2-minute cooldown, and it's a 30% damage reduction buff that you can put on anybody. And Safeguard is incredible as well, where it's only a 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds, but it's only on a 30-second cooldown. Even as a protection warrior, you're going to bring Skull Banner, which is on a 3-minute cooldown. This lasts 10 seconds and absolutely should be used at high moments of burst damage during things like Bloodlust. For anyone within 30 yards of Demoralizing Banner, they're going to deal 10% damage less, which basically means your raid is going to be taking 10% less damage, and just tons more utility, even like Disrupting Shout being able to do an AoE interrupt. The prop warrior can put out insane AoE and cleave damage, and obviously very high single target damage as well. And if you're wondering when I'm talking about all of these tanks why I'm obsessing over damage, tanks in Mist of Pandaria have the ability to put out absolutely amazing damage while still maintaining high self-heals and high survivability. Because most classes heals and absorbs scale with attack power as tanks, you get really high vengeance and you can almost just sustain yourself. So outside of sustaining your own health pool, you should be putting out as much damage as physically possible. This is why Blood DK, Brewmaster and Prop Warrior have made my top 3, because Blood DK will be doing insane single target, Brewmaster will be doing insane AoE, and Prop Warrior is kind of a nice mix of both. And all 3 of them have incredible survivability in terms of self-healing and bring really good stuff to the raid. Now I'm going to quickfire all the reasons why Resto Shaman, Disc Priest and Resto Druid are my top 3 healer choices and why you should probably play one of them when Mr. Pandaria comes, or probably in the pre-patch, so you're at least ready for MOP. Firstly, I'm sure it will come to no surprise if you've seen any videos about Mr. Pandaria at all. My first choice would be Resto Shaman. I do think Resto Shaman's going to be one of those healing classes that you are going to be seeing stacked in 25-man and an absolute staple of every 10-man group. They are pretty much the holy paladin of Mr. Pandaria. Not only do they bring insane AoE healing by having everyone stacking your healing rain, they get the addition of Healing Tide Totem, which heals 12 players in 25-man and 5 in 10-man, but it pulses every 2 seconds, healing for an absolute truckload of healing. Of course, they still bring Mana Tide Totem as well to get some mana back for all of your casters. Spirit Link Totem, which is just as powerful in Mist of Pandaria as it has been in Cataclysm. But you even get an offensive buff now as well called Stormlash Totem, which is on a 5-minute cooldown, and it empowers your entire raid, causing attacks to trigger bursts of electricity, dealing additional nature damage to their target. Now, this does add up across the entire raid, and when you've got multiple shamans dropping this back to back, it's just a ton of extra damage. You even get the addition of Capacitor Totem now, which is a fantastic AoE stun, particularly strong in places like challenge modes. The general healing style hasn't changed that much, but you get some really good quality of life changes which you might have been used to in Cataclysm from certain set bonuses. For example, when you chain heal a target with Riptide on them, the heal is still going to be 25% more effective, but chain heal no longer actually consumes the Riptide effect, the same way that the tier 12 set actually stopped that from happening as well. If you enjoy weaving in lightning bolts to get mana back, that's not going to change because you've got a glyph that gives you 2% of your mana anytime lightning bolt strikes an enemy. The fantastic thing now is without Spirit Walker's Grace, you can actually cast Lightning Bolt while moving. That is such a big one, to be able to on the move get mana back when you're moving from A to B. Absolutely fantastic. And then means you've still got Spirit Walker's Grace for if you need to heal while you're moving. Some of the talent choices are absolutely amazing, like Echo of Elements, where it's got a chance to proc Echo of Elements and duplicate any damage or healing spell you cause. And Ancestral Guidance is a really strong raid cooldown that you can use that just amplifies the amount of healing that you're putting out. Another option outside of Ancestral Guidance, though, which I do really like on stacked fights, is Conductivity. Basically, when you're stood in your healing rain casting, most of your abilities extend the duration by 3.5 seconds, which then just takes your healing rain up to a 40-second duration. So being able to put healing rain down and stand there and heal and do lightning bolts like you ordinarily would and not need to worry about putting healing rain down every 10 seconds feels absolutely amazing. Overall, the Resto Shaman just brings so much output in terms of HPS and cooldowns to your raid that it's just a must-have. There's no surprise this priest has made it in at number 2 because it is super strong. The key things you need to know about are Spirit Shell, which is an amazing cooldown, and it's only on a 1-minute cooldown as well, which causes all of your heals over the next 10 seconds to no longer heal, but instead create absorption shields that last 15 seconds. So on very high predictable damage that's going to come in, you can basically just get Spirit Shell out on as many people as possible, and sometimes almost completely negate the damage that's about to come in. Atonement has changed now, so it's added Penance into it as well, so it's Smite, Holy Fire and Penance, and it heals a nearby low health target for 90% of the damage dealt. The great thing now about Atonement is it's 40 yards, so now you're actually going to be able to use Atonement to reliably heal your range DPS, not just your tanks and melee. With your level 90 talents being Cascade, Divine Star and Halo, you've got a big heal on a fairly short cooldown for any situation. With Cascade, if everyone's spread out, Divine Star if everyone's clumped up, and Halo if you can be at that perfect 25-yard distance and let out a really big AoE burst of healing, which also does damage as well. You just have a heal for every situation now as Disc. And if in Cataclysm when you start casting Penance, something spawns under your feet and you need to move, you don't even need to worry about that anymore. Because while Glyph of Penance increases the mana cost by 20%, it now allows you to cast it while moving, which is a really fair trade-off. And finally, the movement you can bring to individuals that need it in your raid with things like Body and Soul, which will be nothing new to you because it ordinarily comes from talents anyway, but for Holy Priests. But now you get Angelic Feather, where on a 10-second recharge with 3 charges, you can place a feather down that increases movement speed by 80%, for 6 seconds for the next person that walks through it. Now you're going to be able to macro this to cast it directly on the person that you want it on anyway, and it's just fantastic. So if a tank needs to move out for a mechanic, you can give them a feather, they've now got 80% movement speed. Overall, the Disc Priest is absolutely solid, and while I could probably talk about it for another 15-20 minutes, I want to keep this as short as possible. So let's move on to Resto Druid. With me being fully biased towards Druid straight away, I have to say Resto Druid is actually the most fun healer to play, in my opinion. On the face of it, Resto Druid plays almost how it has for the last few expansions, where you're keeping Life Bloom on a tank, you're spreading hots across the raid, and you're just watching that big HPS rack up. The thing is, it's had some minor additions that just make it even more overpowered, and while it's an absolute powerhouse of health per second, the one area it lacks in is raid utility. With the only real raid cooldown that you get being Tranquility still, it's just a raw healing cooldown. So it's not like Spirit Shell where you can stop that incoming damage because you're building the absorbs up. It's not like Spirit Link where it equalizes everyone's health and does damage reduction as well. This is just pure throughput. And that's kind of where a Resto Druid excels. It excels at just everyone being stacked up and pumping out huge HPS. So in my opinion, an absolute must-have in a 25-man raid, and in 10-man raids, it's a great third healer. So if it was a Boomy main spec, and then Resto off spec. Because having the ability to be able to put a mushroom down that gives permanent efflorescence, and then what happens with this mushroom is all of your rejuve overhealing goes into the mushroom up to a maximum of 200% of your health, and then you have a new ability called Bloom where you can bloom this mushroom and it will then divide all that healing amongst everybody hit. But the Glyph of Efflorescence is not only overpowered but a must-have for every Resto Druid, because this is what turns your mushroom into basically a permanent healing rain. You can put it down anywhere you want, you can move it and not lose the power that is generated from your overhealing, so there's absolutely no negative to this whatsoever. Being able to still get Tree of Life if you want it for a talent being Incarnation, now actually having a damage reduction cooldown to be able to put on a tank, so it's not a raid cooldown, like I said, you really lack in the raid cooldown department, but you do get Iron Bark, which is on a 1-minute cooldown, and it's a 20% damage reduction for your tank. So having this in as part of a rotation with things like your Warrior's Vigilance means you can keep damage reduction cooldowns on your tank almost all the time. Being able to use Dream of Cenarius, which basically turns you into an Atonement Druid because your Wraths do more damage and heal for the amount of damage dealt, and even when you go into Bear or Cat form, you're gaining all of your intellect as agility, so you can actually do some damage in Cat form during downtime, or, you know, if you was just sort of a backup healer. Resto Druid is absolutely fantastic and had to make my top 3 because, honestly, I think out of the other choices being Holy Paladin and Mistweaver, and Holy Priest, I suppose I should mention as well, Resto Druid just puts out insane numbers. It does, of course, bring other raid utility as well with things like knockbacks and Ursul's Vortex, which is a particular favourite of mine where anyone that moves out of the Vortex gets sucked back in. So it's absolutely amazing for gathering up ads or keeping ads stacked. The Resto Druid is just a really good option, but outside of having the ability to be able to put your efflorescence anywhere you want with your mushroom, stacking the big heals up on the mushroom to bloom it, it plays very, very similar to how it has for the last couple of expansions. And they're my top 3 healers. Next up will be top 3 melee DPS that not only are going to be able to put out amazing damage, but also bring lots to your raid. So firstly is the Rogue, and specifically Sub-Rogue. Not only is it one of the highest single target DPS across the board, not just amongst melee, it's also no longer completely shafted on AoE anymore because of the addition of combo points coming from Fan and Knives, and also the addition of Crimson Tempest, which is an AoE finisher. So where at the moment, yes, in Cataclysm, Sub-Rogue absolutely pumps, as soon as there's extra targets, they start to fall behind because all they've really got is single target. Well, that's not the case anymore. They can do reasonable AoE and exceptional single target. Having a rogue in the team can really simplify Will of the Emperor Heroic as well, which is the final boss in Mogersham Vaults, and will make any rogue in a 10-man or multiple rogues in a 25-man extremely sought after. The entire fight is an ad fight, and as you kill ads, sparks spawn, and these sparks need soaking. Rogues can soak these for days and need almost no help. So having a rogue for the final boss is also extremely useful and worthy of a mention. Smoke Bomb is actually really useful now, where up until this point Hagara and Dragon Soul is about the only place where Smoke Bombs had any use. Now it's an actual flat damage reduction for everybody stood in your Smoke Bomb, and it's a substantial damage reduction as well, being 20%. Shroud of Concealment for rogues is absolutely amazing as well to be able to skip trash, and it's really fun in PvP as well, because you can mass stealth your entire group and bypass trash. That could be in challenge modes, raids, dungeons, literally anywhere. And excluding Hunter's Pets, rogues are one of only 2 classes that can actually bring the spell damage taken debuff as well, which is incredibly valuable. Whilst I know you're probably not overly bothered about what they bring and what they don't bring and what gets added, you just want to know if they do great damage, and they absolutely do, which is exactly why it's made it to number 1 in my top 3. Secondly, will probably come as no surprise at all, is a warrior, and specifically we're talking Arms Warrior early on. Whilst Fury does pick up and even overtake Arms much later in the expansion, if you're wanting to be competitive as a warrior, you're going to find yourself as Arms. Now, Arms is an absolute pumper DPS in both single target and AoE. The rotation feels so much more fluid without having to stance dance, because certain stances are no longer needed for certain abilities. Instead, the stances give separate bonuses, which I'll put on screen now, and depending on what you want will depend on what stance you're in. So actually every stance can be useful as every spec of warrior, given the right situation. Even as a DPS warrior, you can now bring Vigilance, which is a 30% damage reduction cooldown, which ordinarily you're going to use on your tank. Being able to bring such a powerful external cooldown to your tank and still bring things like Rallying Cry, which is going to increase everyone's max health at times where high damage is about to come in, just makes a warrior's toolkit insane. And if that ain't enough, you also get 3 new additions in the form of banners. Only 2 of the banners are really relevant, but you get Demoralizing Banner, which reduces the damage done by enemy targets that are near the banner by 10%, meaning they do 10% less damage, your raid takes 10% less damage. And then the big one, which is Skull Banner, which increases critical strike damage by 20%. And this is for the entire raid. So if you're pairing things like Skull Banner with Stormlash from a Shaman and then popping Bloodlust, this is mental damage, and it gets really good when we get access to certain trinkets in places like Throne of Thunder. And there's even some really small changes like Slam. Now, Slam does really good damage, obviously, and you're used to using Slam in your rotation already. But it's now instant, so it's not got that annoying cast time anymore. And when you've got Sweeping Strikes active, 35% of the damage dealt by Slam also hits any other target within 2 yards. So yes, it's a very short range, but the fact that Slam just flat out AoEs everything as well, when you've already got things like Bloodbath and Blade Storm together, so you're absolutely melting stuff, and then as soon as that finishes, you can still start firing out loads of damage with slams on everything that you've just got bleeding from Bloodbath. The amount of damage you can put out is just absolutely insane. And of course, you bring so much utility, even with things like an AoE interrupt. And then third in my top 3 for melee DPS might be one that takes you by surprise because you've not really heard a great deal about them, but it would have to be Unholy DK. Now, if we're talking purely from a damage perspective, I think Unholy DK in the first phase is going to be exactly the same as they was in Wrath of the Lich King and even the first phase of Kata. They're going to be absolutely pumping. They have incredibly high consistent sustained damage and even get an execute ability now, which is called Soul Reaper. It deals weapon damage and afflicts the target with Soul Reaper, and after 5 seconds, if the target's below 35% health, it's going to do a truckload of damage to them, and if the enemy dies before the effect triggers, you get 50% haste for 5 seconds. You'll still be building stacks up and using Dark Transformation. You'll still be using Gargoyle as a big DPS cooldown. And overall, really, the rotation doesn't change all that much. But being able to bring things like Anti-Magic Zone just from talent, so every spec of DK can bring this. Having an amazing off-spec if you needed to tank at any point, because Blood DK is also going to be insane in the first phase, and made my number 1 out of top 3 tanks. A mass AoE grip called Gorefiend's Grasp, where you can grip all enemies within a 20-yard range of a target, all to that location, or even Remorseless Winter, which is an AoE stun, which slowly ramps up, slowing their movement speed until it finally stuns them for 6 seconds. 3 very different ways to manage your resource now at your level 75 talents, being Blood Tap, Runic Empowerment and Runic Corruption, and even getting a little bit of a movement speed increase with Death's Advance. It's only a 30% movement speed increase on a 30-second cooldown, but while you've got the talent, it's just a passive 10% speed boost. I should even mention the fact that if you don't run Anti-Magic Zone because it's not needed on a particular fight, you can run Purgatory, which essentially gives you a second life. When you take fatal damage that's going to kill you, there's a few seconds your healers get to essentially heal you out of Purgatory, and you'll still be alive. The Unholy DK, whilst in my opinion personally, doesn't go through drastic amounts of changes in comparison to some of the other classes, it's going to be absolutely pumping in the first phase, and I'll be really shocked if it's not. And once we're in the beta, and we're actually getting to see all this at endgame, we'll know whether this was right or wrong, but these would definitely be safe choices in my opinion. When it comes to the best range DPS in Mist of Pandaria, this was actually the easiest top 3 to come up with. Number 1 is going to be the Survival Hunter. I'm focusing purely on survival, but Beast Mastery is not a bad spec either, but I do think as an all-round single target AoE, cleave, consistent damage, survival is the way to go. And I actually personally think that survival hunters are going to be dominating throughout the entire first and second phase. The good thing is, if you like survival hunter in Cataclysm, you're absolutely going to love it in Mist of Pandaria, because overall the rotation doesn't change all that much. You're still putting up Serpent Sting and keeping it up with Cobra Shot. You're going to be using Explosive Shot on cooldown and fishing for resets of your Explosive Shot with Lock and Load, keeping Black Arrow on the target, which is what gives you your Lock and Load procs, and then just filling in as much as you can with Arcane Shot. But not only are you going to be doing amazing damage just with the basics, you get some really good additions of talents. With a really powerful cooldown like a Murder of Crows, where you summon a flock of crows to attack the target over the next 30 seconds, and if it's used on a target below 20% health, or let's call it execute range, the cooldown's reduced to 60 seconds. Having Binding Shot, which is an amazing AoE stun, particularly strong in places like challenge modes, where you'll fire an arrow down and any targets that move 5 yards away from the arrow are then stunned for 5 seconds, or 3 seconds in PvP. And your level 90 talents are absolutely amazing, even though the choice mainly comes between Glaive Toss and Barrage. Glaive Toss looks absolutely amazing. It's only on a 15-second cooldown at a 15 focus cost, and it does significant damage. And Barrage is one of my favourite hunter abilities ever added to the game. Firing off a barrage of ridiculous amounts of arrows just looks and feels great and does amazing damage, and it's usable while moving. Some of the real big things that just enable Hunter to do so much damage though is being able to Cobra Shot or Steady Shot on the move without changing aspects, having no minimum range anymore, so you're no longer punished if you need to stack in melee for certain mechanics, as in you've got no dead zone at all anymore, you can stand as close to the boss as you want. Both Hunter's Mark and Aspect of the Hawk both scaling with you now, so as your gear gets better, these provide more bonus, because Hunter's Mark increases the amount of ranged damage they're going to take by 5%, and Aspect of the Hawk now increases your ranged attack power by 35%, rather than it being a fixed amount. So the more ranged attack power you've got, the bigger the bonus you get from Aspect of the Hawk. Not needing to get lucky in raids and get 2 weapons anymore, because you only need ranged weapons now, and basically having a pet for absolutely every occasion. And some of them are really important, like Spell Haste is a particularly tricky one to get because you have to have something like an Ellie Shaman, a Shadow Priest, or a Balanced Druid. So if you haven't got one of those hybrid casters, having a hunter that can bring it is obviously really good. And also on pets, it's changed, so now it doesn't matter what pet you're using, so if you need to bring the 5% Spell Haste buff, you just spec it as Ferocity. So the pets are no longer broken down by Tenacity, Cunning, or Ferocity. You select that on a pet-by-pet basis. Overall, the Hunter is a big pumper, it's fun to play, and I genuinely think it's going to be one of the strongest ranged, particularly for the first couple of phases. Now, I'm sure it comes to absolutely no surprise that Warlocks made it into number 2. If we was talking later on in the expansion, it would definitely be sitting at number 1. All 3 specs are strong, with Affliction being incredibly strong on any multi-dotting situations, but Destruction as an all-round single-target pumper that also can do really good AoE and cleave just feels absolutely fantastic to play. With all 3 specs getting completely different resource systems now unique to the spec that you were in, for example, Affliction getting Soul Shards, or Destruction having Burning Embers, all 3 specs feel like they're playing differently. Overall, Destruction hasn't changed all that much though in terms of how the rotation feels, with you keeping up Immolate, using Shadow Burn as an execute when the target's below 20% health, using Conflagrate for backdraft procs to reduce both the mana and cast time of your next spells, using Chaos Bolt that hits like an absolute truck and always crits, so because it crits it synergizes particularly well with a Warrior's Skull banner that increases critical strike damage by 20%, and you always want to be pumping as many Chaos Bolts out as you can when you see that skull banners up. And exactly the same goes for your Dark Soul cooldown, which increases your critical strike chance by 30%. Now, because of how Chaos Bolt works, where the damage of it is actually increased by your critical strike chance, just by using Dark Soul, you're going to be getting 30% extra damage on every Chaos Bolt cast. You're still using Incinerate as a filler, and some of your really powerful abilities, and to be fair, even just amazing utility, comes from your talents. Having ridiculously powerful personal cooldowns with things like Dark Bargain, where it basically makes you immune to all damage for 8 seconds, but when it fades, 50% of the damage that you prevented is then dealt over 8 seconds. Still having access to things like an AoE stun from Shadow Fury, or even having Burning Rush, where at the cost of 4% of your maximum health a second, it increases your movement speed by 50%, to even being able to use Grimoire of Supremacy to summon more powerful demons, Grimoire of Service, so on a cooldown you can get a second demon out, which is obviously particularly strong as demonology when you're using a Felguard, or Grimoire of Sacrifice. For someone like me who hates pet classes, being able to just sacrifice your pet, which is nothing new to a Warlock and we've seen it over the years, just feels absolutely amazing. And when you sack it, you get an ability, so if you got rid of, let's say, a Voidwalker, you're going to get an extra cooldown, or if you got rid of your Fell Hunter, you've got an Interrupt. They're just amazing, and we've not even looked at the best ones yet, because Archimonde's Darkness gives you a second charge of your big cooldown being Dark Soul, so on a standstill fight, getting 2 charges of your big cooldown is absolutely amazing. But what most Warlocks will absolutely love is Kil'jaeden's Cunning, because you can now Malefic Grasp, Incinerate, and Shadow Bolt while moving. Now, all 3 of these are basically your filler ability for each spec, with Malefic Grasp being for Affliction, Incinerate for Destruction, and Shadow Bolt for Demonology. You do also have the option on a 1-minute cooldown of using Manaroth's Fury, which increases the area that your AoE abilities do by 500%, and the damage by 100% of Seed of Corruption, Hellfire, Immolation Aura, and Rain of Fire for 10 seconds. So if there's moments in a fight where there's incredibly bursty AoE, using Manaroth's Fury can also be an option. But overall, Destruction puts out some insane damage and is not really an overly complicated class to play either. So honestly, if you're thinking about a ranged DPS to play, Destruction Warlock, absolute pumper. If you want a bit more of a complicated spec to play where there's a lot more plates to spin, a lot more things to manage, then Affliction on anything where there's more than one target is absolutely insane as well. Which takes us to number 3, which it pains me to say that actually out of the 3, this is my favourite, and that's the Mage, and in particular, the Frost Mage. Frost being viable, and not only viable, but being the top DPS spec for Mage in the first couple of phases feels absolutely fantastic. When I mentioned about Destruction Warlock being easy to play, it doesn't get much easier than Frost Mage, because all you're really doing is keeping your bomb up, which we'll get to those in a second, using Frozen Orb on cooldown, and then pretty much just consuming your procs. So when you get a Brain Freeze proc, you're using Frostfire Bolt. When you've got Fingers of Frost procs, you're using Ice Lance, and then your filler is Frostbolt. You can even get a talent called Ice Flows, which has got 3 charges on a 20-second recharge where you can cast while moving. The thing I absolutely love about Frost Mage is how it feels like everything that you're pumping into the boss is from instant casts, because you're getting showered in procs from Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze, so you're just firing off instant Ice Lances, instant Frostfire Bolts, and spending such a small percentage of the fight actually hardcasting any ability that whenever you need to Frostbolt, you've got Ice Flows to use it when you're moving. The addition of Alter Time is absolutely amazing as well. What Alter Time does is returns you to your current location, health, mana, buffs, and debuffs when you cast it a second time or after 6 seconds. So what this means is you can use it 6 seconds before Icy Veins runs out, and you're going to get that extended by 6 seconds. And in an ideal situation, you're going to want to use it when you've got Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze procs, so you're going to consume them in that 6-second window, and then as soon as the 6-second expires from Alter Time, you're going to get all of those charges back again. Being able to choose one of 3 very powerful level 90 talents between Invocation, Rune of Power, and Incanter's Ward, the choice in general is normally pretty simple because it's always going to be between Invocation and Rune of Power, and to be fair, as a Frost Mage, 90% of the time, it's just Invocation. And what Invocation does is removes the Evocation cooldown and reduces the cast time of it by 50%. And once you do a full Evocation, which is about 2.7 seconds, you're going to gain 15% increased spell damage, but passively regenerate 50% less mana. Now, because you're not going to go in the 1 minute that this buff's up for, it doesn't really matter, because as soon as it drops down again, you're going to Evocate again, that's going to give your mana back and give you the 15% damage buff again. Rune of Power is an option, and you can have 2 runes down at a time, and while while you're stood within 5 yards of one of your runes, you regenerate loads of mana and increases your spell damage by 15%. Now this replaces evocation and has got a shorter cast time as well than what it would take for you to channel a full evocate. So if you know it's a fight where you rarely need to move and you can stand within your rune of power, then this is going to be the one you're going to use. But on the most part, Invocation, even if there's a little bit of movement, is going to be the way to go. Incanter's Ward, kind of not even worth talking about, but if you're lazy and you don't want to manage either of the other two, you can just use this for a passive 6% spell damage at all times. One thing that has changed though is you actually have a choice between 3 types of bombs now. And no, you don't use Living Bomb just because you're fire, Frost Bomb just because you're frost, and Never Tempest just because you're arcane. It actually completely depends on how many targets you're fighting as to which one of these you're going to use. For single target, you're going to be using Living Bomb. For big AoE, where you know there's going to be a lot of mobs stacked up when the bomb expires because most of the damage comes from the explosion at the end, you're going to use Frost Bomb. And then if you want one that don't rely on everything being exactly stacked, Never Tempest is really strong as well. The things that make Frost really powerful though is things like Glyph of Splitting Ice, which causes your Ice Lance and Icicles to hit one additional target for 50% damage. Now Ice Lance damage is already quadrupled against frozen targets, or when you've got your fingers of Frost procs up, and while the Frost Mage Mastery in Cataclysm is pretty rubbish, just increasing damage dealt against frozen targets, that mastery now changes to Icicles, and it looks really good as well as doing lots of damage. And what it does is when you damage enemies with Frostbolt and Frostfire Bolt, a portion of that damage, based on your mastery of course, is then stored as Icicles with you. But not only that, it also increases the damage that your pet does with Water Bolt as well. 5 Icicles can be stored at once, and when you Ice Lance, all of the Icicles begin launching at the target. So not only are the Icicles launching at the target, they're also doing 50% of that damage to something stood next to it, and so is your Ice Lance. And the fact that Living Bomb works with a pandemic system now as well, so as long as you're refreshing Living Bomb when there's 3 seconds or less left, it still gets the explosion. It all just adds up to Frostmage just being such a good spec and such a fun spec to play. I genuinely love playing Frostmage. And me talking about a caster like that is not something you hear very often. Now I could sit and go through every single mage change, but that'll be for the mage change video. So if you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like and subscribe. Consider joining the channel as a member, like these guys that are scrolling down on the screen have, and I'll see you on the next one.